Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the groovy Von Manor, where Roger and I have just got back from a fantastic vacation in the 1970s. Yeah, man, Roger has a time machine, and we decided, you know what? This new century's lame. Let's go back to when things were really fun. So we went back to the 1970s and had a great time. And there were some things that I noticed about the 1970s. First of all, the clothes were pretty weird. The hair tended to be really bad. The furniture was strange. Everything was odd. Cool. Cars were cool, I have to say. I liked the cars. The music was pretty good. I liked the music a lot, actually. There was some cool stuff going on in the 1970s, but also a lot of weirdness. But one thing we noticed is that our favorite subgenre, sword and sorcery, was really big in the 1970s. And as we traveled around through the years of the 1970s in Roger's time machine, we noticed that, yeah, sword and sorcery, man, it was really pretty big. So as odd and weird as some of the things were in the 1970s, and as, you know, some things in the 1970s were crap, but one thing that was really cool were books. Books tended to be really cool in the 1970s. You know, if you liked reading science fiction and fantasy and horror, there's some interesting stuff that was happening in the 70s. And yeah, sword and sorcery, man, it was big. So let's talk about it. Why the hell was sword and sorcery big? Because this seemed to be the decade when it kind of peaked. And I guess it's not that weird when you think about it, considering the kind of times that people were living through. And this had started in the 60s. So sword and sorcery really came back in the 1960s. Of course, sword and sorcery was, well, it was kind of invented by my favorite author of all time, Robert E. Howard. And he invented it in a story called The Shadow Kingdom, which was written back in the 1920s and published in Weird Tales. It was a King Cole story, really good one. And then, of course, Robert E. Howard went on to write the Conan stories in the 1930s for Weird Tales magazine. And then Conan kind of disappeared for a while. Robert E. Howard passed away. Some of Robert E. Howard's stories were republished by Arkham House. And then the Conan stories were republished in the 1950s from Gnome Press, but he really didn't come back until the 1960s. And there were a lot of things going on in the 1960s. You know, there was war, you know, the Vietnam War, which seemed to last forever, and distrust in politicians. You should always distrust politicians. Things like that. It led to a feeling, it led to a desire to escape. A desire to escape the humdrum reality you might be living in. And sword and sorcery kind of offers sort of the ultimate escape in a way, and it provides you with usually a very capable hero. Not always, but usually it provides you with a very capable hero who is strong enough to conquer whatever obstacles, which are very clear-cut. They tend to be in sword and sorcery. Not always, but they tend to be. Some clear-cut obstacles to overcome. Which doesn't mean that sword and sorcery has to be simple, because it doesn't. You could have a lot of complexity, actually, in sword and sorcery. And you will find that in some of the authors that I'm going to be talking about. But let's go back further than the 1970s. Let's go back to the 1960s, when sword and sorcery really started coming back. And one of the things that brought it back wasn't sword and sorcery at all. It was Edgar Rice Burroughs. Edgar Rice Burroughs, who wrote A Princess of Mars, was kind of instrumental in bringing about the popularity of this kind of story, a fantastic adventure story with swords and daring do. Swashbuckling stuff, which Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom series provided big time. Edgar Rice Burroughs came back into popularity in the 1960s. Edgar Rice Burroughs, who wrote The Princess of Mars in 1912 and then went on to create Tarzan of the Apes and wrote a ton of really entertaining adventure stories. And suddenly in the 1960s, publishers realized that a lot of the works of Edgar Rice Burroughs had lapsed and gone into the public domain. They were no longer under copyright. Anybody could publish Edgar Rice Burroughs novels because, the rights had lapsed. So suddenly, where Edgar Rice Burroughs had kind of disappeared for a while, suddenly he reappeared and everybody was publishing Edgar Rice Burroughs. And anybody could. And so suddenly there was a huge flood of Edgar Rice Burroughs on the market. And everybody was reading these stories once again. And what the Martian series is it's technically a science fiction series, but it's really close to being fantasy. It provides that kind of story. The fantastic elements are all science fiction. And this type of story, which was popular for a long time in the 1930s, 1920s and 30s, in pulp magazines, suddenly was brought back into paperbacks. And you had anthologies and other books written in Sword and Planet, and some of the older Sword and Planet type of stories started being republished by Ace Books and some others. So this sort of cleared the way and made people interested in this kind of adventure story once again. It seemed perfect for the time, the 1960s, when things just seemed to be going very strange. Things seemed to be getting weird. And then some of the sword and sorcery, the actual genuine sword and sorcery, started to show up. A lot of the sword and sorcery stories were actually influenced pretty heavily by Burroughs. Robert E. Howard was influenced by Edgar Rice Burroughs. So this goes right to the beginning of Sword and Sorcery, the influence on Edgar Rice Burroughs on this type of story. And it was in the 60s that a lot of the stuff that became really popular in the 1970s started to show up. Most importantly, probably, well, let me step back a bit, because it wasn't just Edgar Rice Burroughs who cleared the way for this. I have to give credit, of course, to Tolkien with The Lord of the Rings, which started to become very popular in the 1960s, and also, along with Sword and Sorcery and other types of fantasy, started to become really popular in the 70s. It's hard to think back to those days sometimes when Lord of the Rings was kind of this cool book that was not yet a literary classic. There were no movies except for a few cartoons that showed up a little later. But, no movies, no terrible TV shows. It was just a cool book and an enthralling fantasy that got a lot of people into fantasy, The Lord of the Rings. And it was just such a cool thing. And so I have to give Tolkien credit, because even though this is not sword and sorcery, it's kind of high fantasy. I don't know how you want to describe it nowadays. They're epic fantasy, I suppose. But this is when Lord of the Rings started becoming really big, was in the 60s and the 1970s. And that cleared the way for sword and sorcery, a different type of fantasy, with the return of Conan after all of these years. Now, Conan did come back in the 1950s, but it was in the 1960s that he showed back up in the Lancer paperbacks with great cover art by Frank Frazetta. Now, I've talked about this series of books before and how I think it was marred by the editorial intrusions of L. Sprague de Camp, and how L. Sprague de Camp put his own stories in there and mixed them up with Robert E. Howard's stories. That's a whole other thing. But it has to be said that this series of books with these fantastic covers really brought back sword and sorcery in the 1960s and brought back an interest in sword and sorcery. And this series of books, which started off in the 1960s, became really big in the 1970s. Again, it's not really a surprise because Robert E. Howard, his Conan stories are just great escapist fiction, which you needed in the Watergate era. Vietnam's still going on. There's a lot of things to be unhappy about in the 1970s. And I think that urge to escape into a world where you can put yourself in the place of a hero who is tremendously capable and able to overcome all obstacles, no matter how bad they might be, usually supernatural horrors. You know, it's understandable why Conan became so big. And Conan isn't just a simple type of sword and sorcery either. I think probably Robert E. Howard's writing appealed to people in the 1970s too because it was dark. You know, it was actually behind all these sword and sorcery daring do. It was taking place in a dark, kind of pessimistic world. Robert E. Howard had that quality to his writing, and I think that added something and appealed to people at the time. But because of the popularity of this series, you've got a bunch of other sword and sorcery characters that returned or became popular during this time. One I would mention would be a very important one, which was Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, which was created by Fritz Leiber. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser was a series that had been around a while. I think the first book publication, if I'm remembering correctly, was in the 1950s. But it was in the 1970s with the sword and sorcery boom that this series really started getting going and becoming popular. Great series with a lot of nuance and excitement, and it was very inventive. Great characters. I highly recommend this series. It was probably at its most popular during the 1970s and into the 1980s. But great series, and also, of course, Elric, Michael Moorcock's Elric, another character that was created earlier. He was published in the 1960s, but it was his paperback book publications that became very big in the 1970s. Again, he was around before that in the 60s, but it was in the 70s that he really started to sell. And Michael Moorcock is an author who wrote a bunch of different fantasy series and some science fiction, but his fantasy really became big in the 1970s. And he wrote a lot of fantasy aside from Elric, a lot of stuff, a lot of books, which should be reprinted. I think it's time for Michael Moorcock's non-Elric work to really come back in a big way. I think it's time. His Elric books were recently republished in very nice hardcovers. There's a new Elric novel that was just published. I think some of his other stuff should be reprinted as well. But certainly Elric, who was kind of the anti-Conan, really interesting character, the king of Melnibone, the emperor of Melnibone, who, with his great soul-sucking sword, Stormbringer, he would kill you and take your soul to give him strength. Great series of stories, man, and very popular in the 1970s. And another character, which I've talked about before, who kind of went right along with Elric in as kind of being a dark fantasy character, was of course Karl Edward Wagner's Cain. Karl Edward Wagner, a great writer who was at his best at this time in the 1970s, and he wrote these really dark gothic sword and sorcery type stories of Cain. Cain was a character who was not a hero. He was really more of a villain. He did terrible, terrible things in these stories. But he was fascinated, and you wanted to read about him, even though he was just so bad. And sometimes he could be heroic. Sometimes he did heroic things, but you never knew with this guy, Kane, man. He was... Yeah, you didn't want to mess with this guy too much. Basically, if you saw Kane coming, you just want to go the other way. But tremendously entertaining. Great stuff that became really big in the 1970s. Kind of hard to get now. Kane is a little hard to get now. You can get ebook copies of his novels, but otherwise you're pretty much searching eBay for the Kane books, unfortunately. And those were the big stars, I think, for the 1970s for Sword and Sorcery. But there was a lot of other stuff out there. Again, a bunch of characters that were created in the 60s that became popular in the 70s. Most of them inspired directly by Conan the Barbarian, like Brack the Barbarian, by John Jakes, who became a very popular historical writer of historical fiction. But he created Brack, and Brack was a lot of fun. Also, I'm glancing down at my notes so I don't forget all these folks. Can we forget Kothar, created by Gardner F. Fox? Well, to be honest, a lot of people have forgotten Kothar, but there was Kothar that showed up. Kothar. Entertaining stories. Worth a look. There have been a couple of videos that have shown up on BookTube about Kothar, worth checking out. And then there, of course, was Thongor. Thongor, created by Lynn Carter. Lynn Carter, it's worth just stepping back and talking a bit about Lynn Carter, who again became popular in the 1970s, who wrote a bunch of books that were very pastiche books. I mean, everything he wrote, it seemed like, was based on either Edgar Rice Burroughs or Robert E. Howard, or a combination of the two, including Thongor. But he was an important figure in the 1970s as an editor more than anything else. He did create entertaining books. His books tend to be... Sometimes his books are terrible. I mean, he was kind of a hack, but he was a fun hack. And his books were tremendously derivative, but still, they tended to be really entertaining. So, Lynn Carter. But he was a great editor, man. And he edited the Ballantine Adult Fantasy series, which it was an amazing and important series of books that brought back a lot of classic fantasy writers that had mostly been forgotten. And this series of books was incredible. I only have a few of them, but they're well worth checking out. And if you ever see any of them, pick them up because they're well worth it. He was a really good editor of this kind of thing. And he also created a very important Sword and Sorcery series in the 70s, the Flashing Swords series of anthologies, paperback anthologies, that also had book club editions, so you'll see some hardbacks of this Flashing Swords series floating around. There were some cool anthologies that showed up in the 1970s, but this was probably maybe the most important one, the Flashing Swords series. Great stuff, and one of the things that made Sword and Sorcery big in the 1970s. But these books that I'm talking about, they're not the only things that made Sword and Sorcery big in the 70s. There were also some other things going on at the time, including Marvel Comics publishing the Conan the Barbarian comic book. This color comic book brought Sword and Sorcery and this type of story to a whole different audience. And a lot of the people that were buying Sword and Sorcery books started picking this comic book up, and a lot of people that bought this comic book wanted to start reading books that were kind of like this. And probably, or possibly even more importantly, there was The Savage Sword of Conan, a black and white magazine that had black and white comics from Marvel Comics that were a little bit more mature and closer to Robert E. Howard's source material, probably. a lot of fun. This was a great magazine, and yeah, like I said, a more mature magazine that probably reached a different, not an entirely different audience, but it might have reached some people that the color comic book didn't. And again, helped popularize this kind of story. I mean, now Marvel didn't just stop with Conan. It brought back our old friend Thongor. Our old friend Thongor returned. So you got some other characters showing up in the comics. And another thing that was really important that happened in the 1970s that helped popularize Sword and Sorcery was a game that showed up in 1974, and that is, of course, Dungeons and Dragons. I don't know that you really can fairly talk about Sword and Sorcery in the 70s without talking about Dungeons and Dragons. A game that became very popular, and it's still very popular today, but showed up on the scene in the 1970s. And, of course, kids that played this game, and adults who played this game, were probably interested in fantasy or fantasy fiction, and would become interested in fantasy fiction just because of how fun this game was. And so yeah, you can't talk about Sword and Sorcery probably without talking about the importance of Dungeons and Dragons, and it was important. And so Sword and Sorcery, it kind of peaked in the 1970s, and all of these books and a ton more than I've even mentioned showed up around this time. It was really the perfect time for this kind of thing. It started to wane a bit in the later 80s. It was good in the beginning of the 80s because you had the Conan the Barbarian film. So the Conan the Barbarian movie came out. You had other writers that were showing up in the 1980s who were writing Sword and Sorcery. Got David Gemmell just sitting over here, and he was a writer who kept on with the Sword and Sorcery tradition. But it has sort of fallen out of favor as other types of fantasy have sort of gained in popularity. Nowadays, fantasy is just so huge and so diverse, and a lot of the elements that we kind of are familiar with from Sword and Sorcery have been adopted or absorbed by other types of fantasy fiction. Game of Thrones was a book that is high fantasy or epic fantasy, I suppose, but also has a lot of sword and sorcery in there. And so this genre that was created by Robert E. Howard still is out there. It's still out there, but it's not nearly as popular as it was. Although I am happy to see that Robert E. Howard seems to be gaining some popularity once again. His books are readily available. So Conan, who showed up and made Sword and Sorcery popular in this line of books, is readily available now in a lot of other publications. This is probably the best one, and I highly recommend it. I guess Roger and I will shut up now because we've been going on for a while, and it's an hour later than I thought it would be. What happened with your time machine, Roger? I don't know what's going on. But yeah, that's just a little visit to Sword and Sorcery in the 1970s. I will catch you next time.